8 pages or so, and it's all about some of these questions that we're now having to answer because of how good we're getting at ascertaining genetic information and manipulating genomes for our service, okay, for our own purposes. And so chapter 15 is just all about specific questions that come up. And as far as the first half is concerned, doesn't really give you much information about how you handle those. But lucky for us, we had pretty much a whole day, pretty close to a whole day, where all we did was we talked about building a really comprehensive, robust moral theory. Okay? And I like to call it a composite moral theory, in which you take ideas from never utilitarianism, because that's sad, but possibly deontology if you want to talk about duties, although it doesn't really give you any reason why you have those moral duties, but natural law, divine command, and virtue ethics, I think, do a really good job of helping us to address some really complicated problems. And so we're going to do that today. We're going to present some of these ethical dilemmas, and we are going to try to approach them with a nice, robust, composite moral framework. Okay? Sound good? And even if it doesn't, we're still going to do that. There aren't really any key terms from chapter 15 in the first half or the second half, so we're going to get right to it. And so the first thing they do in chapter 15 is they basically summarize why these studies have been so successful. And I thought it was helpful to go back over this to review some of the aspects of the Human Genome Project, but I also think it gives us a nice foundation for understanding, if you really want to talk about moral duty, maybe some idea about where that duty can come from other than the duty to, to serve God and to carry out what God has tasked you with. So why has genetic research been so successful? Well, first off, the Human Genome Project and other endeavors like ENCODE, have had both administrative and public support. This is very unusual. It's very unusual in the sciences that you get this kind of support from both the public and the administrative support. And it's one of those things that's, in some ways, it's apolitical. And then so there you don't have to worry about, like, when you transition from one administration to the next, losing funding. In many ways, it echoes what happened in the 1970s and 1980s with like environmental efforts. Believe it or not, in the late 60s, 1970s, and early 1980s, environmental measures were apolitical. And a lot of actual work got done. That's where you get like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, a number of things that actually went a long way towards making it to where the Great Lakes no longer caught on fire just randomly when unprovoked, because the pollution was so high. I mean, it wasn't unprovoked, you need a spark to get a fire. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, the Great Lakes big chunks of them would catch fire all the time. It was pretty awkward. Yeah. When? Why? Why did it become political? Maybe for the same reason that everything does, is because it infringes on big business, right? And so whenever something infringes, usually the most likely reason why something would become a political issue is if it infringes on the capitalism that this country was built around, And so as soon as some of these measures started to impact the way some big companies operated, then you start getting a lot of money driving into it, and when money comes in, then things become political issues, right? When somebody's money is at stake, that's when they become. Yeah, so that started happening about in the middle of the 1980s. But you didn't ask when, you asked why, but I'll give you the when as well. And so this has made it incredibly productive. people like it, and so you're like, why does it matter if the public supports it? It's 2 points from now. I thought it was going to be the next point, but it's not the next point. So I'll save that question for just a moment. Another reason why this is so successful is because unlike many issues, this issue is big. This is big with a lot of different facets, and so there's a benefit to being collaborative. It's not like you're racing to find, to develop a pharmaceutical drug that does this specific thing, right? This was a huge monumental task that was not going to be carried out by a single research lab. And so because of that, it actually encouraged research institutions and entire governments to really collaborate to tackle this issue, okay? In many ways, I mean, you can look at it as far as like the desire to tackle it is similar to like the desire that what you have with a lot of the developed countries to try to tackle climate change, right? But then again, that becomes a political issue because of various reasons. But you can see in a lot of ways what's happening now kind of shows you what was happening 20 years ago at the beginning of the Human Genome Project, where you have a lot of developed countries that are really starting to invest money and time and resources and scientists into dealing with climate change. All right, this is why it matters to have both administrative and public support, because you can commercialize it. If you can privatize something and you can commercialize it, people will pay for something. Now it becomes very beneficial. You're talking about, on one hand, if you have administrative support, you have access to billions of dollars of scientific funding. If the public wants it, you have access to trillions of dollars of people's money that they're willing to spend for things, right? You're like, trillions of dollars, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And so this is where there's some value in where you have basically support from both administrative and the public. If people want it, they'll pay for it. If people pay for it, there's money for carrying out research. And then another thing is most people in developed countries are comfortable with technological advances. And so the area of genetics with the Human Genome Project or the ENCODE project, everything you learn becomes immediately a source of some new technological innovation, right? Everything we learn about the human genome becomes an opportunity for us to now use that information to build some new pharmaceutical agent, right? Or to use that information to build some new way in which we can tell you your ancestry, or tell you your propensity for developing this particular genetic illness, or develop some new treatment for a genetic illness. And so because of that, basically everything you find is almost immediately commercializable, if that's even a word. But people are comfortable with that, and people are comfortable and even excited about things changing all the time. And then another reason is we're getting more comfortable with whenever these new technologies arise, basically having to address the ethical questions that come up with it. Now, unfortunately, from my perspective, but I'm not afraid to share you my disdain for utilitarian ethics. Unfortunately, I think most of the public at large and scientists specifically operate under some form of a utilitarian model of morality, if they operate under any mode of morality. And unfortunately with that, you get some really disappointing choices that get made in how we handle some of these ethical dilemmas. But fortunately, I think we're getting more comfortable talking through some of these and getting better at building collaborative groups that make decisions as a unit, so an individual scientist doesn't have to make those decisions on what to do. All right. Now that's just like, okay, cool, like here's why it was successful, but what are some of these ethical dilemmas? Okay, what are some of these ethical dilemmas? And again, how can we apply a nice moral framework to address these? Okay, So if you get upset about redundancy, you're going to hate this because every one of my points starts with "as our understanding of something." So as our understanding of genetics increases, we have an increased need to ensure justice by making technologies available to all. Now, we talked about when we were doing our ethical class, we talked about deontology and the 4 moral duties that are basically the framework for medical ethics. And they were benevolence, I think, or beneficence, which is do good, non-maleficence, do no harm, justice, and then the other one is autonomy, protect somebody's ability to make their own decisions. And so one of these is justice, and so you can talk about this from just a deontological perspective, that justice basically means you treat everyone the same regardless of their ability to pay for that. Right, and so that's where you oftentimes see this applied in the area of medicine. Well, when we're talking about developing these new treatments, we've talked about one of the benefits of genetics research is it should allow us to make pharmaceutical agents more efficiently, which should reduce costs. But some of these technologies, initially are very expensive. And when something is only available to those that are incredibly wealthy, you have a bit of an ethical dilemma, right? And that is like, how do you make it to where people can get it even if they can't actually pay for it? Yeah.
But doesn't feel like that's something that happens pretty often, especially in the States, because like, if you can't afford it, you'll go to a public hospital. A lot of people die in like the waiting rooms of public hospitals. So I don't know. It seems like this isn't the first time this issue pops up.
Oh, it's not. No. I'm just saying the more we know, the more this becomes an issue. At least in the area of genetics applications. Okay? At least in the area of genetic application. Now, as far as from a composite moral theory, you could definitely talk about divine command theory and our requirement as Christians to basically represent those that are voiceless and powerless. And you can talk about virtue ethics and basically ask the question of what would somebody that's governed by compassion and love do to try to make some of these things that could be groundbreaking available. And but again, a lot of this, it's like, how is this moral dilemma any different than like, hey, I'm going to go to Taco Bell, but certainly not everybody in the world could afford to go to Taco Bell. Is that an ethical dilemma? And it's like, kind of it is. But it's also, a physical necessity. So, what are you going to do? Yeah, Sadie.
I was asking, why are things that could benefit the planet or benefit humankind, why are they so politicized, and why do people argue against it if they can do so much good? Like, what argument could they possibly have for justifying, like, no, we can't do that, even though it can save like thousands, if not millions of people? Like cost versus.
Well, there are a lot of reasons. If you're talking about just from a morality standpoint, well, first of all, there's always a cost associated with everything. And sometimes that cost is going to be a monetary cost, but sometimes that cost is some other type of cost. And so it's always a question of, it's not always, it's often going to be a question of, is it worth what it costs, right? So when all you're doing is looking at the benefit, it oversimplifies the issue, right? And that's what we have a tendency to do, is kind of oversimplify issues. And they're like, oh man, it's just so simple. It's like, you hate poor people, right? And that's why you don't want this to happen. And it's like, no, you're oversimplifying the issue, right? It's you're ignoring what the costs are and only talking about the benefits. So that's, I maybe in generality, to address the answer to your question, is oftentimes there are disagreements on whether the cost whether the benefits justify the costs of whatever whatever it is that you might mean specifically. Yeah, I think that's it. So this one was maybe one of the more simple issues. Okay, this one starts to get a little bit more complicated. So as we become better able to predict the development of disease, we must provide better counseling and education. Because here's what happens. So, I don't know, 10 days ago, how long ago did you send me that email, David, telling me I have an increased likelihood to develop prostate cancer? 10 days ago? All right.
It was on a Saturday. So.
It was on a Saturday? So 9 days ago.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, typically people hear that and they like lose their minds, right? Like me, I consider myself to be a rational person. I went and explored it further, and he's right. But my risk factor is like 2. So I'm twice as likely as somebody without those 2 markers to develop prostate cancer. I'm about 500 times as likely as the average person to die of a heart attack long before I have a chance to get prostate cancer, right? So it's like, that's not real high on my worry list. I also drive a lot because I commute, so I'm probably 25 times more likely to die in a car accident than the average person. Maybe not in Southern California, because Southern California is kind of a commuting culture. Yeah, I am trying to think of other things that I do. I live a pretty boring life. I can't go skydiving because I weigh too much. So it's like if you skydive, my brother's like, hey, come skydiving with me for my birthday. Like, bro, I'm sorry. It's not gonna happen. Sorry, man, I'm sharing a lot. I'm oversharing. Oh yeah, sorry. And so, but the average person is gonna freak out about this, and to avoid that, we really have to become really good at making sure people understand what you're saying, right? You really have to make sure people understand what you're saying. Now, with monogenic genetic illnesses, that's one thing, right? It's like if you bring your kid in and you have no idea what's happening, and then you realize that they weren't screened for PKU and they have PKU. By that point, it's kind of too late, right? By the time you start seeing symptoms of it, you've already experienced the massive deterioration in the developmental process that happens when you're exposed to phenylalanine and you have PKU, right? So that's one thing. But when you're talking about these complex genetic illnesses, even if you've got you're 5 times more likely to develop it than somebody without that genetic marker. People need to understand, what does that actually mean? And so what do you do to be very wise and approach this in the proper way, right? Yeah.
Good question. So I feel like every time I have a conversation about like anything that has to do with likelihood, people will just throw in anecdotal evidence. They'll be like, "Oh, my uncle had 5 times more likelihood, and he's fine, so therefore." And it's like, do you combat that with like more anecdotal things, or do you go back straight to statistics? Because I tend to go to statistics, but is that not a good way to like convince people you're right?
I use anecdotal evidence only to make people feel uncomfortable as I make fun of myself and my family. I don't particularly care for using anecdotal evidence in support of anything, nor do I care very much for others using it. It's kind of the thing that's like, it's along the same lines where it's like, let's say a couple, like they've got 5 daughters all in a row, or 6 daughters all in a row. And it's like, certainly, if we have a 7th, right, it's got to be a boy, right? Because we already had 6 girls. What are the chances of getting a 7th girl? And you're like, 1/2, which is pretty much exactly what it was with the first girl, right? Unless, you've got, something else going on. You're like, yeah, it really doesn't matter. And so it's like, if you and your uncle are both 5 times more likely to develop something, it really doesn't matter that he didn't get it. That doesn't make you any more or less likely to get it. It's just, yeah. And so I think we just need to do a better job educating people. And here, I think we have a lot of reasons in which we could justify saying, like, we really need to invest in doing this. Is one, I mean, even if you just want to go to like your 4 big moral duties, and you want to talk about autonomy, or you want to talk about doing good or not doing harm, like you need to prepare people emotionally and and maybe even spiritually for being able to handle some information. And that's like if you do 23andMe and you do the disease screening, they make you fill out like a whole questionnaire before they reveal to you your genetic propensity for genetic illnesses. And then when you go and you do the ones that are markers for Alzheimer's and one of the other like big markers that they have, they make you do another separate questionnaire where they make you basically say, I understand that this does not mean that I'm going to get Alzheimer's tomorrow, right? And so, but then that being said, it's like, nobody reads those things. You just click next, 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 next. And then if you have to put a signature, it's like, this is a digital signature. I'm just going to click here. And so, I think as far as a responsibility perspective, a lot of my view on this has to do not a whole lot with divine command theory. I don't know if I can find a lot of support in what God has told us our responsibilities are as Christians to do this, but I do it a lot from virtue ethics and even not so much for natural law either. But when I ask questions of like, what would a loving person do with the information that they have? And it's like, if it's valuable information, you share it, right? And you teach others with it. And I think when you understand the way something works, you have a responsibility to help other people understand it as clearly as possible. Now, I'm not going to say everybody's going to understand it as well as you will, but you have a responsibility to do that. And now that all of you have taken a genetics class, I honestly think you have a moral responsibility to help people to understand what these things mean. And I think you're going to start seeing it being applied very soon, very soon in your life. And if people don't already call you, my mom calls me. I don't know what my mom thinks that I am, but my mom calls me whenever she's having some kind of an ailment, and she's like, nah! This is how my mom's when she's not feeling well. Actually, she says Matthew usually. And she's like, I can't feel my left foot. And I'm like, well, Mom, that's a problem because you're diabetic, and that's a common sign of diabetes. And then she's like, no, you don't understand. You don't understand. I had something resting on my left leg, and now my left foot is numb. And I was like, I don't know. I don't understand what you want me to do, Mom. Like, do you want me to come and pick you up and take you to the hospital? She's like, no, your dad can do that. And I was like, why don't you wait it out? See what happens. If you regain feeling, you're good. If you don't, you might want to go check to see if you've got, permanent nerve damage. So, yeah, it's very fun. Or then my mom called me the other day, and she's like, your sister's dog tore its ACL. I'm like, okay. Do you want me to perform that surgery? Because I'm pretty sure I'll do it very poorly. I don't know what you want from me. I mean, it's a big... Anyways, sorry. Okay. All right. This one, I think, this one's a big one. So as we find ethnic and racial correlations with disease, we need to develop efforts to prevent discrimination. And so what you find is, and this is going to be especially true in the coming years, decades at most, when you start to see that there are certain genetic illnesses that are very expensive to treat, and they correlate significantly with certain ethnic groups, you're going to see some way in which insurance companies will find a way to not insure certain people groups. I mean, it's the way things work, right? It's going to happen, and so I think what we have as a responsibility, and I think as a privilege of living in a place like the United States, where they're basically every people group on Earth, besides the very remote and reproductively isolated, live in the United States in decent numbers. And so we have a wonderful opportunity, but also a responsibility here to think through how do we do this. And in many ways, this echoes kind of this first point here, and ensuring that everybody gets fair treatment. And a lot of this does come from natural law theory. I mean, if you truly believe that every human being is created in God's image, which I think is a really hard sell to not believe that, then what that means is that basically everybody has certain, I mean, to use the language of the founding fathers, inalienable rights, right? As being human, right? Being human. And so, and then you've got, virtue ethics and, did I tell you about the What Would Jesus Do bracelets when we talked about virtue ethics? I mean, a lot of times it's silly when you're like, a lot of times it's silly to apply that, but in some of these big ethical dilemmas, it's a helpful thing to model after, especially in a couple of points.
I wasn't vaccinated.
He probably was not vaccinated. You are right. I think you're right about that. He probably also would not have gone to Taco Bell. I mean, maybe he would have. No, he probably would have gone to Taco Bell because, I mean, that's where the people that are really in need of spiritual and physical healing tend to hang out. But I'm pretty sure he never went to a Taco Bell. Yeah, so most likely. This one is becoming increasingly difficult as we build collaborative health networks and as we start to pull other professionals into making these decisions. We need to really do a better job of protecting patient privacy. And so this becomes a challenge when you are coordinating efforts of healthcare professionals, of geneticists, of statisticians, and you're bringing in different people to help make decisions. You've got to do things well.
I think we kind of given up on privacy though.
I think rather than saying we've given up on it, I would say this. I would say we found a way to commercialize privacy.
But like the government knows everything in my life, and like there's nothing I can do about it. So I don't care if healthcare professional knows now.
I think you might be. What's the term I'm looking for? I think you might be a little bit paranoid on that. I don't. First,
It's just the truth. I don't care.
Maybe I think you'd be surprised at how difficult it is for people to figure out some things about you. Yeah.
But like Google knows.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. If you accept cookies, there are ways to protect your privacy. So I think what we've done, what I would say is this. I would say we have found a way to commercialize privacy and to make people pay for it. So I don't know if that means we've abandoned it. What I think that means is it means we've withheld it unless you're willing to pay for it. But if you're willing to if you're willing to pay to keep your stuff private, there are plenty of ways in which you can do that.
But still, so it's assumed that it's public unless you pay. Can we?
Some things.
Sorry.
Yeah. But not patient. So it is, I don't know if you've ever had to like get your medical records taken from one hospital to another. It is complicated. It is so difficult because one thing I think we've done well is ensure patient privacy. That's one thing I think we've done a really good job of, and your academic privacy. And so it becomes very difficult to get your academic information from one institution to another, and it's pretty difficult to get your patient information. But as we continue to expand these collaborative networks, some of those things are just going to become bigger challenges to keep patient privacy protected at all costs. Yeah, and then there's a question of how much privacy do you need? Because I mean, if your genome's good, like you pretty much want everybody to know about it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, hey, I don't have any, I don't have anything bad in my genome.
What's a good genome?
Mine. Mine is a great genome. Yeah, yeah, thanks. Yeah. I would say one in which you don't have significant increased likelihoods for debilitating genetic illnesses. Yeah.
What would be the issue with if people did know that?
What would be that if you did have an increase?
And if the doctor knew about it, what would be the issue?
I think the potential there is to lose insurance based on your genetic pre-programming, because like it's obviously a pre-existing condition because you were born with that genome.
But could they just make it illegal for insurance companies to do that and just tell everyone? Feels like an easy fix. It's less privacy than.
Can't you make it? Yeah. Can't you make it illegal to, sell drugs or,
That's Colorado.
sell? Yeah. Nothing's illegal in Colorado. Yes. Oh man. Gosh, we're just having ourselves all kinds of fun here. All right. So as we improve the development of pharmaceuticals, we have an increased need to regulate the production of narcotics, unless, of course, you live in Colorado. Sorry, anybody listening to this recording that is part of the government of Colorado. Actually, apology rescinded. I do not apologize. So, this was a very interesting. There was an entire paragraph in the textbook that described it. That's basically this: if we become better at making really focused pharmaceuticals very efficiently, and so it reduces the cost and makes them very high quality, it's very easy to take those technologies and to just do what you want with it, right? And so instead of, if you can individualize treatment for pain, you can individualize treatment to accomplish whatever you want, whatever experience that you want. And so here, I don't think you need to talk a lot about this. The issues, the dominant ethical framework tends to be utilitarianism, and then it's basically like, well, if it doesn't hurt anyone else, what's the problem? Where it's like, well, the problem with utilitarian ethics is, one, it requires you to know the future, and two, it requires you to actually know all the people impacted by decisions that you make, both of which are impossible. As far as I know, nobody knows the future, nor does anyone know the implications of all of their decisions. What's that? Thanos. Thanos knows the future in a limited scope. All right. Oh, the rest of them are all about modifying genomes. And so this is where you get things get a little bit trickier. Now, I want to share, I don't know how many of you followed this news story that came out in the fall of the Chinese scientists who modified the genomes of the twins to make them resistant to HIV. And so this started pretty recently. I think this year was just the second time that you had an international gathering of geneticists and bioethicists at, I don't know, some kind of a summit. I forget exactly what they call it. And last year, so before he actually modified the genomes, they had decided as a community to not do anything, even though they could, until they could work out some more, basically some more animal testing. And then that happened, and now kind of that whole community's scrambling to try to figure out what they're going to do in response. Now, what was interesting is, just to give you a little bit of a background, it's the dad is HIV positive. The dad of the twins is HIV positive, but has not developed AIDS, has his HIV in check. Mom is HIV negative. And then so a big issue that the community is having is just that it was completely unnecessary, right? So like if mom is HIV positive, then it might be more necessary to make the babies resistant to HIV because you can transmit it through birth. Yeah.
Does China care about this committee?
This scientist doesn't care very much about the committee. I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know.
The government?
I don't think governments as a whole care very much about international committees, just on the whole. I think that you can find plenty of evidence in support of that. National governments tend to only care about what's best for that nation. And if the desires of some international organization support what that nation believes is good, then they'll care. So yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. Yeah. But I will just tell you this, that as our technologies improve to modify genomes and to modify it very specifically in a very focused way, the value of these technologies is going to increase dramatically. And the potential uses for these technologies are going to increase dramatically. All right. So, as we become better at modifying genomes, we must develop better protocols for regulating the application of these technologies. And so, one of the things that you see a lot is that there are regulations in place that basically state that you can modify genomes for the purpose of reducing risk for disease, or you can modify genomes for the purpose of reducing the severity of disease, but you can't modify genomes for the purpose of increasing physical, mental, or some other kind of performance. Okay? A lot of regulations have language along those lines. But without a lot of information about what that means. Plus, the difference between that seems to be a little hard to understand, right? Seems to be a little bit, at least for me, hard to understand the difference between modifying a genome to reduce the likelihood that you will develop, let's say, Alzheimer's, where at the same time not allow yourself to modify the genome in an event to maybe increase intelligence. That distinction is hard to find. However, I think when you're just talking about in general, so you have a whole suite of technologies that fall under the umbrella of what's called transhumanism. Okay? And this umbrella of transhumanism basically refers to any technology that modifies humans in a genetic, physiological, or anatomical way.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, so it's any technology that modifies humans in a genetic, a physiological, or an anatomical way. So underneath that umbrella would be things like prosthetics, organ transplants, blood transfusions. Okay, all of those would fall under that. Now, where you get into kind of some issues with ethical questions is things that would also fall under that umbrella would be genetic engineering. What the Chinese scientists did of modifying the gene to increase resistance to disease. And then you could, potentially you could modify genomes to increase your propensity for putting on more muscle tissue, right? We don't understand, to me it still surprises me. I thought when I was an undergrad, when was I an undergrad? I graduated in 2008. So when I was an undergrad taking genetics, I thought 10 years from now, we're going to have a pretty good understanding of the role between genotype and most of the things. And we still don't. We still don't have a good idea. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't understand. And so I think the biggest issue is, even though our technology is getting good enough that if you have a G in a position, I can change it to an A. And just in one cell. Like, we can do that. The problem is we still don't understand all of the implications of what that's actually going to do. We just don't, right? And then so it's like the same thing with like genetically modifying food, genetically modifying crops. It's like, it sounds wonderful. You know, you get this crop to basically come to the point in which you can, what's the term I'm looking for? When you collect your crop. Yeah, when you can harvest it, thank you. Where you can harvest it multiple times a year and the actual output is greater. And then it's like, yeah, but then there are other implications as far as what happens to people who actually eat it, right? And you're like, oh, it's not a big problem. People don't eat humans. It's like, well, first of all, you're not right about that. Some people do eat humans. And then second of all, that's kind of not, I think, our biggest concern, right? Anyways. Yeah.
Wouldn't you have issues with like those regulations of not doing things that like enhance mental or physical ability? Because like, couldn't you classify like a mental handicap as a disease? Like if someone has like autism or something, that would be.
Well, so then you need some standard. And that's the issue. Is if you're like, okay, so we can do it to say correct somebody that's got a mutation that's going to lead to a mental handicap, right? So you can do that because that will get them to be more normal. But you can't do it to make somebody exceptional, right? So then you need some standard. It's like, well, what is normal and what is exceptional, right? And so that's where I think this becomes very messy. It becomes very messy. Yeah.
Do you have a good example of abnormal intelligence?
Obviously, it's not you. I'm just kidding.
Abnormal? I don't know.
That's either a roast or I don't know which one it is.
Intelligence is very difficult to quantify. So like we have some ways in which we quantify intelligence. You know, you've got IQ, you have other intelligence, measures. It's very difficult to quantify. So I would answer your question with no, I don't. And then so it's like, can we do it up to average or can you do it up to like maximum, right? So it's like, can you modify somebody genetically to get them to have an IQ? Well, first of all, we don't have the technology to be able to do this. But if you could, to get to an IQ that's the greatest ever recorded, right? Or can you only get it up to, I think an average IQ is like probably 110, 115. I don't even know. Yeah.
But with all these things, like even with like physical strength and like mental abilities, you can only give people the ability to develop it into so much of a smarter, faster form.
Right, but
you
then
can't actually
you-
make them do that.
Yeah.
Because it takes a lot of time for
No, you're right. 23andMe told me I am genetically similar to elite power athletes. That is untapped potential, right? So it's like, we can modify people to do that, but unless you actually put it to work,
So it's not
Yeah,
like
Sadie.
So like with all this talk, is it theoretically possible to kind of create like our own version of Captain America?
Maybe if we knew better about all of the things that contribute to strength, yeah. That's today probably not. 20 years from now, maybe, yeah, maybe, but I don't know. As we become better at modifying genomes, we also have to develop better means to ascertain the effects, right? And so this is something I think undoubtedly we need to do. We need to become better able to understand what's going to happen if we modify somebody's genes to, let's say, because basically here's the idea. People are like, okay, so you had vaccines, right, that eradicated certain viral illnesses. And it's like, okay, well, can we use genomics and genome editing to eradicate cystic fibrosis, to eradicate PKU, to eradicate anything you want? Because if you modified somebody's genome, now you'd have to do it using in vitro fertilization, because by the time you got to an embryo that's got millions or tens of millions of cells, you'd have to modify every individual cell. So you'd have to do it, using in vitro fertilization. But once you modify that, let's say somebody, you form an embryo, and it would have cystic fibrosis. It's got 2 mutant alleles, and you change those into the normal allele. And now not only does it no longer have cystic fibrosis, but it's not a carrier for it either. And so all of its offspring now can't have cystic fibrosis. And so the idea is there, not can we, because we can, but should we use this to eradicate genetic illnesses? And then what about more complex genetic illnesses? Now it's more of like, can we? Like, can we use this technology to eradicate type 2 diabetes? Or Alzheimer's? Or cardiovascular disease? Yeah.
But in this case, it's not about like helping someone who has a genetic illness, but like making someone who does not have a genetic illness. Like the person isn't a person yet, so it's not like you're eradicating anything, you're just making the person.
Well, you're not building it from scratch, though. You're basically you're facilitating an embryo forming
Right.
and then modifying the embryo.
Right, but most of the issue is that like people don't generally plan that far in advance and just have kids, and then by then it's too late. So it doesn't seem like that's.
Maybe. Have you seen Gattaca?
Yeah, but that's, I mean.
I wouldn't be surprised if 20 years from now you have very few people that are born without using some form of in vitro fertilization. But we'll see. If I'm alive 20 years from now, of course. And then the last point, as we become better at modifying genomes, we must properly temper expectations and present outcomes in an authentic way. And this one I think is especially targeted at geneticists. And listen, here's the reality of being a researcher where your livelihood is dependent upon your ability to continue to secure grant funding. You have to always overemphasize the importance of your work. You have to always overemphasize the importance of your work. And that's why 2 or 3 times a year you'll see an article, a popular level article, talking about some researcher's work and how it is going to end cancer. And it's been happening 2 or 3 times a year for 30 years. And it's just how it works, is like you have to basically build up your own work. And so it's one thing to be like, okay, this could potentially cure cancer. And you're like, okay, well that's something that, I think what are the numbers? 1 in every 3 or 1 in every 4 people will develop cancer during their lifetime, and probably 1 in 6 will die from cancer during their lifetime, those numbers. But those are things where it's like, this is long scale type thinking. Whereas if you're like, okay, we can use this technology to give you basically, to make your baby the best human being that is possible to exist. And you're like, man, I want that. I want that. I mean, I don't want that. I want my kids to be broken, right? And obviously broken so that they can understand their own sinfulness, right? And it's because that's the reality, is the better we are, I think the harder it is for us to understand our own brokenness and our own sinfulness. And that, I think, is one of the things that makes understanding the gospel in a country like ours incredibly difficult. Yeah.
It seems like the best way to go about this though is just to like show people that like genes aren't everything. Like you could have older.
Yeah, I mean, we just have to teach people well. Like we have to help people to understand that even if there is a gene associated with developing an addiction to something, it doesn't mean if you have that gene that you have an excuse for your behavior or that you are going to develop an addiction, right? Because there's a lot in between your genotype and what the actual phenotypic expression is. All right. Well, the quiz will open in about 30 seconds. And that's it. Have a wonderful Monday.